had a brother who was in the Army Air Force, and he was stationed overseas in a weather station, and he had a car in San Francisco, and when he came back to the States, he was stationed at Dayton, Ohio at Wright-Patterson Field, and he said if I came back with his car, he would pay my way back to California through Hope, and I could see my girlfriend. So I decided to get an engagement ring when I went on this trip, and I also had the wedding ring made to match. Well, I mailed it because the jeweler said if I mailed it to Arkansas, I would save the sales tax. So that's what I did. Well, my future wife's mother saw this package, and she opened it up and saw the wedding ring in there. My wife was in her third week at Henderson State College, and after visiting over a weekend, she decided she didn't want me to go back to California without her. So we had kind of a hurried marriage. Her folks were able to get the Emmanuel Baptist Church in Little Rock, the one that they're going to tear down now.
Wow.
And that's where we were married. This was in September of '42. In the meantime, I received word from my mother that I had received a 1A rating in the Army. And my brother, when I was in Dayton, he had wanted me to enlist in the Army Air Force. He said he could get me a good assignment, and I said, oh, well, I'll just take my chances. So I was sworn into the Army and left 2 weeks after we got married, not knowing where I would go, but they sent me to Monterey. That was the reception area, and I think we went through about 3 days of testing and all, and then I got my assignment and ended up in a camp in southern Oregon near Medford called Camp White. Pearl Harbor, of course, came on December 7th, 1941. I was still in bed that Sunday morning. My mother came. I had a room downstairs. This was still in San Francisco. We hadn't moved to Burlingame at that time, and my mother told me to turn on the radio, and of course it was full of all of the bulletins about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and all my friends began to call up, and I remember driving around town with several of my friends, and we saw all these. At that time, they had what they called coast artillery, and these were big guns for the time, and they were putting those in place, and at night they had searchlights, and people were really uptight, and there were all kinds of rumors that, that we were next, and when I think back about how people felt about the Japanese, it was pretty bad, because we didn't know who we could trust or anything. It'd be like if a bunch of Arabs were in San Francisco, and all of what's going on in the Middle East was happening. But the worst thing during that time, I was going to San Francisco Junior College, as it was called at the time, and one of my classmates, who was a real good friend, was a Japanese fella, and he had to be relocated. And I remember the last day he was in class, we were all shook up about it because of the fact that we had grown to like this fella, and he was a real nice fellow, and here he was having to go to what was we thought like a concentration camp, and that was.
Do you remember his name?
No, I don't. I did have several friends in high school that were Japanese, and one in particular, George Ishida was his name, and he and I used to go on photographic jaunts together because we both liked to take pictures, and especially during the fair in San Francisco, we used to go over there and do a lot of photography. But anyway, that was a hard thing to accept. Let's see, I was about, well, they upped the age, they lowered the age, the draft age from 21 to 20. And I was 20 in May of 42, and I had to register soon after that. You're supposed to register within a month after your birthday, and so I figured my days were numbered. We were put on alert. I think it was in January of 44, and because they said we were going to go overseas soon. And I remember my father he actually, his company was working in Hanford, Washington, on that the Manhattan Project. He didn't know what they were doing up there because it was so secretive, but he had clearance and everything, but they wouldn't let him come in the camp so he could say goodbye to me, even though he had all of that clearance. I always thought that was kind of ironic. Anyway, we spent the next month or so getting ready. We had to get all new uniforms and get our shots and physicals, and because some of the fellows didn't pass the physicals either because of physical problems or their age. At that time, they had let a bunch of folks in that were over 38, and the limit was 38 for a while, and then they decided to take in older guys. And can you imagine 38 being old? Anyway, we were ready, and they put us on a troop train. I remember going through Wyoming. It took forever to get from the West Coast to the East Coast. We went through Wyoming and all of those western states, and then through Tennessee and Virginia, and our port of exit was Newport News, Virginia. And we got on these troop ships that ironically were made in Richmond, California by Henry J. Kaiser. And I'm always shuddered when I remember one they had put together in 10 days, and I swear that I got on that one because all the way over to North Africa, that ship was squeaking, and you could hear all this noise, and I wondered how the welds were going to hold it. I went over on a Liberty ship, and they were the smallest troop carrier there were at that time that they made during World War II, because there was a Liberty ship and a Victory ship. And the Victory ship was a little bit larger, but very much the same. Oh gosh, everybody was seasick except one of my friends and I, and we gave them a hard time, and everybody hated us. And I used to get seasick real easy on small craft. I would, but somehow I survived, and I was able to eat every meal. And I think it took us, 10 or 12 days to cross, and it was one of the biggest convoys of the war. Looked like hundreds and hundreds of ships, and they kind of zigzagged because of submarines. And then we went through the Gibraltar entry into the Mediterranean, and then we first stopped at Algiers in Algeria, and then we didn't get off the ship there, but then we went a short time further into Oran, and that's where we got off, and spent about 6 weeks in Oran, and we were doing amphibious landings there, and because we were going to make the invasion of southern France. Well, during that time, I was sent to a bomb disposal school. They made me the bomb disposal NCO of my unit, and that was right near where the French Foreign Legion has their headquarters. I always thought that was, I never got to go in there because I was in this school, and they just taught us how to take care of unexploded munitions that you'd find on the battlefield. Let me tell you, Rome, one of the regiments of my division went into Anzio, but we didn't go in. And in the meantime, while we were getting ready to go over to Italy, well, we didn't know. We thought at first we were going to go into southern France and make that invasion. But things got changed because Rome was taken, and they decided, since we had had training in Oregon in the mountains, that we'd be good to go to Italy instead. So we were reassigned to Italy, and we ended up, we landed in made an amphibious landing, even though there were still ships in that harbor. It was a town in Italy called Civitavecchia. It's right above Rome, and we landed there, and I remember getting off of that landing craft. Somehow it couldn't get to shore, and we had to jump over the side. We were in water up to our chins with a full field pack and our rifles and ammunition. And we must have looked like a scraggly crew. Anyway, we went ashore, and the Germans had already evacuated the city, so we didn't get under any fire. And then we stayed in what had been an orphanage in a town just near there. We stayed there for long enough to get ready to go into combat, and got some more shots and things like that. And excuse me, Axis Sally welcomed us, welcomed the 91st Division to Italy right off demarcation. Now, I told you about my brother. He had kept up with us because his unit was a fighter group that gave close support to the infantry, so he knew exactly where the 91st Division was, and he flew up in an observation plane, caught flak on the way up there, but they didn't bring the plane down, but he commandeered a Jeep and came up to the front where we were getting ready to go into combat, and I got to see my brother just before, it was the day before we actually were committed to our first combat. And then the next day we took our first objective, and I saw my first dead German soldier, and from then on it was one thing after another. It was soon after that we went into Siena. And Siena is one of the most beautiful cities in Italy, but it was declared an open city, which means you can't shoot at anything. So we went in, just kind of went in there, and there were a few pockets of snipers and things like that. The Germans didn't adhere too well to anything being called an open city, because I know when we went into up near Florence, that was supposed to be an open city, and the Germans bombed all the bridges across the Arno River except for one, and they had it ready to go when the Allied soldiers got in there. But we just seemed from then on to go from one mountain to another. Oh no, I was, at that time, I had been promoted to what they call a liaison agent, and that was like a forward observer. We went up to the front and gave the support to the infantry. We used specially made binoculars to zero in on a target. And one thing about it, we had real good maps. They were made from aerial photographs, and if it showed a little black spot there indicating a house, if there were Germans in that house, you could pinpoint that. And the guns weren't that accurate, but if you threw enough rounds on that house, you'd get them. And just for instance, we were in my regiment was in combat for a little over 10 months, and we used over 100,000 rounds of that 105 ammunition, and we got two presidential unit citations, one regimental and one battalion. So we did our job. No, I didn't. I didn't try to think of it. I did see some of the results after some of the battles and seeing the dead bodies. That kind of got you because you figured you were responsible for them. And when I was in charge of the Fire Direction Center, I used to sleep with the phone and radio alongside of me, and if an infantry unit needed some fire, we used to keep one gun on alert all night, and the other guns were available. And if somebody called up and said, I can remember they'd call in and say, we're getting machine gun fire from such and such coordinates, and I'd figure out the fire call and call down to that gun that was on alert, and they'd fire a few rounds. And I remember one guy said, boy, that's perfect. He said, now maybe we can get a little sleep tonight. We were pretty good at doing things like that, and the artillery couldn't do that. They just weren't, they were too large a unit to give the individual fire, and yet those artillery shells were the same size as the 105s in the artillery, but ours just got there a little quicker. Well, they needed some wire. There were several kinds of radios and telephones in World War II. None of them miniaturized like we have now. The walkie-talkie back then, they didn't call them walkie-talkies. They call them handy-talkies, and they were a gadget that big. And they also had what they called a sound power telephone. And it just had a real small wire and just a handset, and it was actuated by the sound of your voice, and you could that took a different wire than the regular telephones. You've seen them with those crank phones and the leather case and so forth. Those were a little more elaborate, but they wanted me to take wire up for this sound power phone to a forward unit. Fighting to get into Pisa, and so I headed out with this all this wire and left my unit, and gosh, there were all kinds of shells going over, and in fact it was just about dusk, and I saw one. The Germans had a railroad gun up above Pisa. There were some mountains up in there, and they had a railroad gun, and it had a pretty slow trajectory to it, and you could actually see those shells go over, and they were big. I think it was, what was the size of that? It was about the size of what we have on our battleships, a big...
Like a 16-inch?
Yeah. I don't know if it was 16-inch or what was the designation, but anyway, these things were happening all around me, and here I was by myself stringing this damn wire up there, and I made it up to this unit, and we connected the sound power telephone, and for that I got the Bronze Star.
Wow.
Because it was under fire, and and I didn't get hurt or anything, but it was sure one of the eerie experiences. I think the fact that I was by myself added to it. After we got the Germans to surrender in Italy, well, I guess all over Europe. What was that, May 8th of 45, I think it was. Then we were assigned to Trieste because there was still a ruckus going on over there that the Yugoslavs thought that it belonged to them, and the Italians said it belonged to Italy, and they were afraid of trouble, so they sent our division up there to keep peace, and ironically, that's where I got wounded after the war was over. This fella in my unit found this object in the water. We had been swimming in this river, and he found this object, and he said, "Hey, Sergeant Guerin, what is this?" And he, instead of bringing it to me, he threw it to me, and it was a hand grenade, but it was one that he had never seen before. And I saw it coming through the air, and I stepped back, but it still got me. So,
Where were you hit?
well, it was mostly superficial. I have one little scar in my chest, and it got me from head to toe, missed my eyes, fortunately, but I was bloody from head to toe, and he took one look at me and ran up to the company, and he said he'd killed Sergeant Guerin. And actually, I spent 10 days in the hospital, but nothing. This wound I have up here didn't penetrate my chest cavity, so it made a little scar, but that was it. And then this finger was stiff. They thought I'd never have the use of it, but now it's as good as new. And I remember when my kids were growing up, I have a little piece of fragment in this finger here, and they always liked to feel it when they were little. They said, "Daddy, let me feel that grenade." But I made it, and I didn't get a Purple Heart for it because the war was over. But I did get an education. That's how I got a free education to go to optometry school. Instead of going under the GI Bill, they had a special thing for disabled veterans called Public Law 16, and that was even better than the GI Bill because we never had to pay anything extra. They paid for everything from paper clips to pencils and paper, and I had 4 years. Actually, the program I went on, we went all year round, so I only used 3 years of my eligibility. I could have gone on and got another year. But anyway, that's how I got my optometry degree. You couldn't write a telegram on either end, except you had to pick out certain words to use. I remember when I got this telegram, it said, "Baby boy born, all doing well. Love, Jackie." And she had to pick those words out. You couldn't ad-lib at all. And all our mail was censored, and it was really interesting when I look back on it now. It's too bad that we have to settle grievances with a war, but I don't know what you do when you have somebody like Mussolini and Hitler and so forth. I will say that at my age, I wouldn't want any part of it, but when you're 20 years old, you look at things entirely different, and I guess that's why they recruit young men to go to war, because you never, once you get in there, you don't have that fear, like anticipation for the unknown, like you do about a lot of things. As you get older, you get more cautious. It's just like whether you're more cautious when you drive or do anything, but when you're kind of carefree when you're 20 years old or so.
Immortal.
Yeah, and when I look back, I probably shudder to think of some of the things I was doing. I mean, even in the training you receive, it can be kind of rugged. Mm-hmm. But no, I don't think. I think if people are civilized, they shouldn't allow Hitlers and Mussolinis and Saddam Husseins and people like that to get started. How do people get brainwashed to let those people even get into positions where they can kill them and cause wars? And Hitler was out to take over the whole of Europe, and they shouldn't have ever let it happen.
Floyd Leverett, born in Blevins, Arkansas, October the 8th, 1922. I live in Hope, Arkansas, 602 East 2nd Street. Well, they drafted us, and we went to Little Rock to be examined for the Army. And we all passed, and me and my brother, we stayed together. They wouldn't separate us. Right. To Biloxi, Mississippi, me and my twin brother. And we stayed together all the time until he got ruptured, had been driven off the plane around, and he got to come home and I had to stay. First thing is, I was tail gunner. The tail gunner position is in the very back of the airplane. And you had to open the doors, get in there. I had two twin 50s on there. And when they locked me in the door, and I could turn around, and I couldn't see the airplane any place because I was up there backwards. It made me sick if I rode front. Well, we get up at 10 o'clock in the night and go for breakfast. If we was flying, we got eggs and bacon and all to eat. And then we go to the briefing room, and they'd tell us where we was going, tell us what to expect on the mission. I was always afraid that if something happened, that they wasn't going to let me out. I couldn't get out until they come back here and lock the door. But I had a tail waist gunner. Well, he's an old Texan there. We just call him Tex. And he says, "You don't worry about that getting out." Says, "If something happens, I'll get you out of there." And so nothing ever happened, and he never did have to get me out of there.
Tell me about flak.
Whew. Get out and walk on it. Shooting it, so you could hear it hitting all over the plane, and see holes coming through it, and they was just shoot them up, and then they'd pop, and then the flak would just go everywhere. And the most we ever got in the airplane was 107 holes. And but the waist gunner was standing up in there, and the flak come up, and he called for the pilot, says, waist gunner to pilot, waist gunner to pilot. I've been hit. My foot is in full of blood. He says, how do you know it's full of blood? He says, look and see how it is. Looked in there, he was sweating, and didn't hurt him at all. But he thought he was hurt. I've shot a lot of them, and I don't know where I ever hit any of them or not. They was pretty far out. And I just couldn't say that I had hit a one, but I give them a lot of ammunition if I didn't. But I don't know where I saw one going down there because there's too many of them flying out there. Well, on D-Day, the sky was full of airplanes. And we got up in the air about 9 o'clock that morning, and before we went over that, dropped our bomb, it was late that afternoon. We was waiting in the line to get to drop our bombs. And I never saw so many airplanes in all my life. Wonder if we hadn't run into each other. But we let them have it. It wasn't much for us, the gunners and all on there. But they didn't ever fly without us. But we just dropped the bombs, just killed whatever we could, I guess. And we was up there about 5 hours before our time to go make a pass to drop our bombs. Man, there was a bunch of us up there. I didn't want to ever kill anybody. But, and I can't say today that I have killed somebody. But I've shot at plenty of them. But it doesn't bother me, because somebody had to do it. And I was in a position that may have killed somebody and not know it. And that don't bother me at all. I just, if you don't know, you don't know. And I go with it that I didn't kill nobody. I guess the one that I remember about the word is going up in the top of Germany. We get up at 10 o'clock, flew all nearly half of the night getting there, then dropping our bombs, and on the way back, having the fighter escorts for us. We'd have P-38s a while, P-47s a while, and one of them got hit, and he come up close to our airplane and says, "Little brother, this is big brother. Big brother, this is little brother. I've been hit. Can I fly in under your belly and carry me home?" And the pilot says, "Yes, crawl up." And he got up under the airplane, and we guarded him all the way in home. Kept him from having to be out there by himself. Of course, he could have got on to anybody, but we was just the ones that he was closest to. Them fighters we was glad to see them. But the thing that bothered us more was flak. Man, I tell you, we got 100 and something no's in our plane one time. And didn't nobody get hurt, but it had on that mission. But we was on one of the missions, and I don't remember where. And Steve, our nose gunner, got shot and hit him in the hip right there, and it knocked a hole in him. The navigator called and told us all that Lawnie was been hit. But we hadn't even dropped our bombs or anything. We had to get rid of them. And he just had to sit up there in the airplane until we could get the bombs off, then come back home. And when we come back, we shot red flares. That gives you the barometer to come down first. And we got down and pulled off on the apron, and ambulance would come out to get Lawnie, and they was in there, and then the airplane come down, and they hollered, look out, he's going to hit us. And he run into the airplane, and we all run, and I fell down, and when I run, when I looked up and down from the airplane, I had passed everybody and was the farthest away from the airplane. But the thing that hurt me the worst, they took him out of the airplane, which they had to do. And I don't know where, we didn't even have a hospital on our base, I don't think. Took him off. And you know, to this day, I have tried and tried and tried, and I cannot find out where that boy's dead not. And I've had 2 or 3 of our crew that come by to see us, and they don't know. And I don't know where he's dead or not, but I sure wish I knew. When I come back from overseas, I got to come back on an old Italian freighter. And it took us about 8 days when to get there. I got off the old thing and started home. And got to Prescott, Arkansas, where I had to get off. And went to my girlfriend's house and called my mother and daddy, and they in Blevins, and in 30 minutes they was down there to get me. And so I had so many days, and when they did, they sent me to California. They had a table from here, 50 foot long, with all kind of fruit and vegetables in there. And I didn't see another person in the Army there. I don't know why I was doing at that place. And I didn't ask, I was enjoying it so much. And then one morning they come up to us and says, you got to go back to Biloxi, Mississippi. So they gave me a ticket. Now, I've done this all by myself. And I got on a train and went to Biloxi, Mississippi. When I got there, did nobody know that I was there, and I didn't tell nobody. I stayed there for about a month and just slept and stayed in the barracks. And I had to finally tell them because my money ran out. And every one of us agreed we'd look after each other. And that's the reason Lawnie kept getting killed, and I didn't get to find out about him. It has hurt me worse than anything. But the rest of us made it through and everything, and that was all I could ask, that we all get back. But they didn't. One of us didn't get back, and can't find out, and never will know. I hope they don't ever have to go to war. And if you do, go and do the best you can and try to save yourself and come back. And that's all. That's all I can do. That's all he can do.
Edward K. Wise, Edward Kelly Wise, W-I-S-E. I was born 1922, November the 18th. And I was born right here in Benton, and I've always lived in Benton. As soon as I finished high school, I was 19 years old, and I borrowed the money and bought the service station right over here on Main Street. Back then it was a mobile service station. And I worked there for I operated that for a year from the time I was 19 to 20, and then I joined the United States Coast Guard, and I had to go out of business because I didn't know when they were going to call me. And I joined in October, and they didn't call me till February. So while I was just marching time, I worked, a friend of mine that run a Western Auto store wanted me to help him, and I just helped him until I got my call. In 1941, I had just taken over that station over there, and that's where I was that Sunday when it happened. I was working. I worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a night. Made good money. I didn't have time to spend it. I don't reckon I've ever made as much money before in my life as I've made accordingly, I could save $100 a week then, that's a lot of money in 41. $100 a week in 42. Lots of money. It'd be equal probably to 500 or 600 right now. And that's where I was when I heard it on the radio, and I said, boy, I'm a goner, and I was. That was about 4 o'clock in the evening of our time. I had a little old radio, I think I paid $19 for it, but it come right over that radio clear as it could. And I joined in October of 42, and I didn't go to February of 43. I went in February the 6th, 1943, and I got out February the 6th, 1946. I got my training in St. Augustine, Florida. They had a big hotel, the Ponce de Leon Hotel, and they had converted it into quarters for the United States Coast Guard. And back then, we had rooms that would have cost us $12 a night, which was a lot of money back then, back in that was 1942. But it was a nice place to stay, and that's where I took my basic training, 3 months there. When we was in boot camp, well, your liberty depended on how good you done your training that week. And we had a little old boy in there that was always out of step. And he wouldn't keep clean. He looked shabby. So that deprived us of liberty one weekend, and my fellow comrades there, they got a hold of him and took him in and used one of these scrub brushes and scrubbed him up, and they kind of straightened him out. Then after that, they sent me out. Well, I first went to Brunswick. Just see, I went to Brunswick, Georgia, I believe, yeah. And they had a barracks there where we stayed, and I stood guard duty for a while, and then they put me as an assistant in the armory there, and I issued the guns for everybody on watch and took care of the guns for several months there, and then they sent me sent me to gunner's mate school. And I went back to St. Augustine and spent 3 months in school there, learning about the guns we had. And then I left there. They sent me to Charleston, South Carolina. And my lieutenant there, I don't know why, but I was a favorite of some kind. I always got a good duty. And he put me with the training department, me and another fellow named Woody Wisdom. So Wise and Wisdom was the instructor there. And we had a lot of small bases throughout, like, well, I traveled from here to as far as Jacksonville, Florida, from Charleston to Jacksonville, and then I traveled as far as Charleston to Wilmington, North Carolina, and we go to all these small bases, which might be 8 or 10 or 15 men, and we'd hold classes there and show them films and all on about the things they needed to know. And it was pretty exciting. Of course, I had never got up and talked in front of people before, and I had to learn. But I did learn. I was ashamed of my first 2 or 3 months, but after I got a hang of it, I wasn't ashamed of it. I had classes as high as 40 people and 2 or 3 gold grades. And I held a class, my first 40-member class was in Savannah, Georgia. And that's just when I first started out, and I done a terrible job. And then I struggled through it. I had the 20 millimeter there. I knew it, but I couldn't tell it, you know. And about 3 months later, I come back and had basically the same class. And when I got through, the officer in charge would come over and shook my hand, said, "You sure have improved." Well, of course, to begin with, mostly guard duty, and then I got in that training department, and it was guns from then on. After, you know, the war was over and wasn't much for us to do, and they sent me back to Charleston, and I was in the armory there. About all I'd done was, we had a bunch of guns there, and we kept them clean, all cleaned up, and done whatever they wanted us to. And I was always so scared of heights. You get up on top of a house and look down, my feet, there'd be cold chills run through. So one day he told me, said, "Take these detonators here and go out there and climb that 100-foot tower and put them in that box out there." Ooh, I said, I know if I'd have told him I was so scared I didn't want to do it, he'd let me off, but I didn't. I climbed up there and put them in there. I wouldn't look down. I just climbed up there and put them in there. I wouldn't have told him no for nothing, because he thought too much of me. Back then when I was on guard duty, we'd done a lot of duty on these Liberty ships. You know, we'd have 6 hours on them, six on and 12 off, and 6 on and 12 off. And I couldn't sleep or eat doing that. I was so mixed up, you know. It was always irregular. I'd rather been 12 on and 12 off than 6 on and 12 off, because it kept me all upset. I couldn't eat right and I couldn't sleep right. So when I got a chance to get out of it, I did. You know, it wasn't hard work, but I'd be on those Liberty ships, and I was always full of pranks. And sometimes them workers on there, they'd slip over somewhere and be about half asleep. And I'd get me a big old piece of iron, slip up behind them and drop it on that deck, and boom, they'd jump. Wake them up. Later on there, they put me on a 365-foot cutter, took me out of the Army there in Charleston. And this was winding down time, and they just put me on there to have a place to put me. We took the 365-foot cutter down to New Orleans for all of us to get discharged. And that's where I got discharged, down there. And I got to be real good friends with the chief bosun mate down there. He'd take me out on Liberty with him sometime. I don't know why people took to me, but they liked me and wanted me to let them go on Liberty. Well, I told him, "Oh boy, okay, I'll let you go with me, but you got to behave if you go with me." Well, he didn't behave, and he didn't go with me anymore. Another told me the same thing. And he didn't behave, and he didn't go with me anymore. Then when come time for discharge, well, the chief bosun mate come around and said, "Guns, you going to stay with me, aren't you?" I said, "No, I'm going home when the discharge comes up." And he didn't believe me. "Oh, you're going to stay, aren't you?" I said, "No, I bet I told him 10 times I wasn't going to stay." So when the time come for us to go, you know, they all lined up and shook hands with you, you know. He wouldn't shake hands with me. They wanted more to do with you. But I just wanted to go home. It would have been a good deal if I'd stayed in there, but I had good duty, but I wanted to come home. Of course, I'd been gone 3 years, and I come home, well, you know, it was all different. All my girlfriends was gone and married. And I just didn't, I was trying to decide whether I wanted to go to college or not, and I drew that $20 a month for about 6 weeks. Then I went to work 2 or 3 different places, and then I come back and bought my old place back, and I stayed there. 10 years. Then I went in the automobile business and stayed 5 years. Then I sold real estate for 3 years. Then I went back in the service station business, and I've been there for 32 years. All the friends I had so many friends. I had a real good friend that I worked with there for about a year. He was a seaman, and he had classes in seamanship. But I have never, I've talked to him on the phone a time or two, but I never have seen him since. I was about 22 years old, and he was 30. And I kind of looked to him to guide me around, and he did. He's a real nice fellow, but I never did get to see him again. He lived in Dallas. He would be, let's see, he'd be, if he's still living, he'd be about 88 years old now. Well, one thing I think, I really didn't care about going in the service, but I think 2 or 3 years is the best thing that can happen to a young fellow being in there. See, I had never been out of the state of Arkansas when I went in the service. And I got the chance to be all along the East Coast and travel through a lot of states, and gave me experiences, and makes you be proud to be an American citizen. And I would say for them that they should thank the Lord that that's what they are. I believe they would when it come down to the nut cutting. I believe they'd be just like we was back then, because you know how they acted during September the 11th. You know, well, everybody come forward then, and I believe they would now.
Admission into the military service was probably had more to do with changing my life than any other thing. When I was separated from the military service, from the Navy, I had accrued time to get an education under the GI Bill. I saw this as the greatest opportunity of my life. No one from my family had ever gone to college or graduated from college. And of course, the year that I was discharged in 1946, I gathered up things and enrolled in Arkansas Tech, and then later on graduated from the University of Arkansas. This obviously would not have occurred. My family were of decent means, but they, first of all, did not necessarily believe in education. Education wasn't all that necessary at that time. I received a decent education at Bryant, but when I showed up on the steps of college, I found out that I had graduated from high school with no high school algebra. I had graduated from high school without any foreign language, and enrolling in the College of Agriculture, the first 2 years was the same as pre-med, so I found out that I didn't really receive as much education as I thought I had. Also, probably the only regret that I have about having gone into the service was that I was just a green, raw country boy. I had very little experience and practically no education other than high school, and I realize now that had I had a little bit more experience, I hadn't traveled at all, that I may have been able to glean more from my experience in the military than I otherwise would have had I had more education. We went to Little Rock, of course, and we were actually inducted. Well, when I reached the boot camp, they found that I had a hearing problem, and all of the rest of the folks that I knew went on ahead. I was delayed, and they kept me around the boot camp for about a week, and I did menial chores and passed the time while they could try to figure out what sort of assignment or training that I should have. And so after about 2 weeks, I went on and was assigned a company and went through boot camp. But I then was with people from like Philadelphia and Louisiana and a lot of strange people. So I went through boot camp with the assignment of making new friends and making my way among strangers, and that's just the destiny. But I did go on to boot camp like everybody else, and I had not had much contact with people from the Northeast, probably two people. One was from Philadelphia. These people from Philly, and somehow I got in boot camp with a group of these fellas, and of course the language vernacular was different. Their mores for behavior were different from mine, and it was very interesting, the things that they thought were important. I didn't really. I was getting onto a new part of the world. And then on the ship that I was assigned to after I came back from being stationed at Pearl were some people from Louisiana. I learned about Cajuns and some of the great foods that they like, and some of the characters that are created by the combination of French and other nationalities. I found those two groups of people extremely interesting. There were some other characters. While I was stationed at Pearl, there was one fellow that he abused alcohol, and we didn't have anything to do, and after we went back to the barracks at the end of the day, we would come back to the office and we would write letters and listen to the radio and that sort of thing. And bless his heart, he always came, and he was somewhere around, but he was always under the influence, and that created a kind of a character that he was kind of a project for all of us to look after while I was there. Those are just some that quickly come to mind. Where was I when the war was over? First of all, when the war was over in Europe, I was part of the choir on the naval station there at IEA, and we had agreed to be part of a broadcast back to the States. The broadcast was being produced by the then Orrin Tucker's orchestra, and the character there was Wee Bonnie Baker, and we had been rehearsing for weeks and weeks to get ready for this presentation back in the States. And this particular night we were at a rehearsal at the Wave Barracks over on the other side of the island, and word came through that the war was over in Europe. Well, all of a sudden, everything just fell apart. There were people everywhere. People were coming on to this way barracks, and we finally got back to the bus and found our way back to the IEA Naval Barracks. I don't know, seemed me like it was 2 o'clock in the morning. Everything was just pandemonium.
Breaks me up.
Well, of course, I should say something about when I came back to the States and it was assigned to new construction and was assigned to the USS Fetchelor, which was as the war ended, they were making destroyers much larger. This one had 2 5-inch guns forward and 1 5-inch gun aft, and in previous years this would have been a light cruiser, but life aboard ship is different. I was assigned to the yeoman's shack. All of the yeoman activities. Yeomen do the work of the officers in the Navy, and for example, I was the executive officer's yeoman, and this meant that, you see, once every week or so there would be inspection in all of the departments aboard the ship by the executive officer. And some yeoman, I was assigned to do this, some yeoman has to follow behind the executive officer, and he'll turn around and say, make a note of this or that, something that he wanted. And so that isn't necessarily a good place to be. I mean, when all these guys see that you're the executive officer snitch and you're writing down all these things. But life aboard ship gets to be pretty simple. All of the leave when you want it to be on liberty. In the Navy, all the liberty cards are kept in the yeoman's shack, and when the odd numbers are out, the even numbers are in, and you find out pretty quick what it is to move a guy's card over here from odd to even. You learn about politics and how it works, and how the potential for doing something for someone else that suddenly you control whether a fellow goes to shore or not in Brooklyn. We had a shakedown period for the ship. We would take it out and fire it and come back in and assess the damage from the firing. Sometimes bulkheads or walls were sprung, and so we were in and out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard with new construction until the ship was ready to go. The yeoman's job was to put together the ship's organization. Man, we typed and proofread, and I'm sure that the ship's organization in the USS Fetchelor, if it's still afloat, is work that we did during this period. We were sent to Newport, Rhode Island, and spent about a month ahead of time when we moved aboard ship, getting the organization ready to go, all of the in-ship regulations in place, so that when the people finally filled out the ship, that they would have orders and regulations about how that certain parts of the ship operated. But that took about 4 weeks before we actually went aboard the USS Fetchelor, which was a new ship. Those are all things that are it's been a long time ago, 1946 to 2004, long time. Things get kind of hazy, but I remember that also on a new ship you also have folks, new officers who just recently graduated from the military academy, and they have to practice docking the destroyer. I can remember each one of these fellas. Of course, remember the yeoman is sort of a step down from the officers themselves. I can remember some of those fellows fresh out of the Naval Academy running that ship into a dock. But that was part of training for me and, of course, the officers aboard the ship. And I remember very well when I got my points for discharge. We had been down to Guantanamo Bay for a cruise and back into Brooklyn, and I had my points for discharge, which you had so much for how long you'd been in, and etc. The executive officer made one more try. Milton, are you sure that you wouldn't like to ship over? You know, there's all sorts of things, opportunities, I can help you, on and on. And I said, well, I think I'd like to try it as a vision for a while. Now, the one last decision that I made in my young, wild life was when we went through the separation center. They asked you, well, wouldn't you like to be discharged into the Naval Reserve? And I said, well, you can get your old rate back in case we have to go to war again and all that. I was a yeoman third class at that time. I said, no, I believe not. Well, it turns out that that decision, as a wild young person, in about 6 months, I would have been called up again had I gone into the reserve, and I would have been in the Korean War instead of at the State University getting a degree. So a lot of folks, a lot of my friends, I talked to one yesterday who got called back to the Korean War because he was discharged into the Naval Reserve rather than being given a clean separation. So those are all things that you don't think much about at the time, but and who knows? I don't know what all happened in the Korean. It was a kind of a tough theater, and a lot of crazy things happened. But when I went through the separation center, I said no to being discharged into the Naval Reserve, and made a big difference down the line. Well, I would say the pendulum swing back and forth. We have had a completely free, open republic, and all of a sudden, at this particular time, our freedom and openness is being challenged because we are attempting to become or try to be more secure in order to survive. I think that probably is going to yield up for us a more a system whereby we may not be as free or as open as we have been in the past. The wonderful things about freedom is that people have the opportunity to develop personally. They don't have to worry about being secure, and only in America we have developed the most the most forward science as far as it relates to human comforts and human ease of operation. We have tremendous transportation. I would only hope that as we give up our openness and as we give up our freedoms, that we will not limit the progress that we have enjoyed, not only giving to America, but to giving to the world. I would hope that we can continue to be as open and as free as we have been in the past, to compensate for the regimentation that security requires in order to survive.